Virtuous Anti-Semitism, address on the occasion of Jewish Christian Brotherhood Week, published in 1976 by Jean Améry. The Brotherhood Week, or Week of Brotherliness, is an event promoting Jewish Christian understanding in initially West Germany that has been taking place annually since 1952. I come to you to speak about the Jewish question, at a point in time when it has apparently resurfaced on a global scale, so these are hardly times that bode well for the thoughts I want to share with you. This is, then, Jewish Christian Brotherhood Week. Yet where are the brothers? If I were more of a cynic, I might quote the American mathematician and chansonnier Tom Lehrer, who, some years ago, on the occasion of an American, quote, Brotherhood Week, sang, quote, "And the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Muslims hate the Hindus, and everybody hates the Jews," end quote. Fortunately, we have not yet reached the point at which the Jews, as an ethnic group and religious community, are subject to a generalized form of burning hatred. Even so, that point is not as far off as the optimists assume. What is already demonstrable is a general feeling of unease vis-a-vis the Jews, misgivings that even, perhaps especially, of people who only 10 years ago were presenting themselves in a rather tedious manner as Philo-Semites, have become palpable in disquieting ways. Anti-Semitism can draw on a historically and psychologically deep-rooted collective infrastructure. If it is currently reinventing itself, 3 decades after the discovery of the Nazis' actions, this is due not only to the amount of time that has passed since and is silently and incessantly eroding the ethical outrage, but also, and perhaps principally, to the developments in the Middle East. Particularly appalling is the fact that it is the young people, and notably those among them who consider themselves socialists in the broadest sense of the word, who are testing our credulity by resorting to this ancient hatred long since considered obsolete. Take the current debate within the Second International, which has traditionally been well disposed towards the Jews and supported Israel. I think the Second International he's referring to is like the Social Democratic International. That would have, like, I guess, parties akin to the German SPD and the British Labour Party, but I'm not sure on that. But there's no anything else to tell me otherwise right here. But he's definitely not referring to the Second International of the pre-World War I. The young socialists, for whom the Palestinians are today the freedom fighters and the Israelis the imperialist oppressors, are demanding that the Second International distance itself from Israel. For the Third International, this goes without saying anyway. It considers Israel a cancerous imperialist growth, and the Jews more generally permanent accomplices of the capitalist conspiracy. Its leader, the Soviet Union, issued the orders. The Third International followed suit. One might well object that Israel has nothing to do with the Jewish problem in general. All this is not an issue of anti-Semitism, but of anti-Israelism. This objection is easily, indeed all too easily, dismissed. Let me quote the German philologist Hans Meyer, a man steeped in the knowledge of Marxism. In his remarkable book Outsiders, he writes, quote, "Whoever attacks Zionism, but by no means wishes to say anything against the Jews, is fooling himself or others. The state of Israel is a Jewish state. Whoever wants to destroy it, avowedly or by means of a policy which cannot but result in its annihilation, is dealing in the anti-Jewish hatred that has been with us since time immemorial. The extent to which this is reflected in the interplay of domestic and foreign policy is demonstrated by the domestic policies of the current anti-Zionist states. It is predicated on the assumption that their own Jewish citizens are virtual Zionists and harasses them accordingly. End quote. I was recently struck while reading the French daily Le Monde, as I do every day, by the extent to which anti-Zionism taps into the traditional anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish hallucinations. In this particular issue, the paper's special correspondent for the Middle East, Michel Tatou, quoted from a photo spread published by the Egyptian government to mark the second anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. The passage in question explained that, quote, "The world over, one does not want Jews to enter the military because they always prioritize money over principles. Usurers are no warriors," end quote. One should resist the temptation to laugh about the fact that this is the voice of a country that was rescued only by the massive pressure exerted on Israel by the United States when push came to shove in October 1973. More importantly, however, as Tattoo pointed out, these remarks were, relatively speaking, moderate in character. In the, quote, tougher, end quote, Arab states, in Syria, Iraq, or Algeria, the prevalent rhetoric was inordinately more aggressive. It goes without saying that all this no longer bears the slightest semblance to, quote, normal, end quote, territorial disputes between sovereign states, such as the conflict between Algeria and Morocco, say. It is pure striker. Anti-Semitism both of the most reprehensible and the most idiotic kind. We must bear in mind, alas, that causes that were both reprehensible and idiotic have triumphed more than once in history, and that one can place no trust whatsoever in the assurances, to the contrary, of one Professor Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Sorry, I missed a footnote here, so I'm going to read it now. It's about Hans Meyer. Hans Meyer, 1907 to 2001, was one of the most important Marxist literary scholars of the 20th century. While his parents were murdered in Auschwitz, he survived the Nazi period in exile in France and Switzerland. Following his return to Germany, he held a chair in literary studies in Leipzig, which was in East Germany, before defecting to West Germany in 1963, where he taught at the Polytechnic in Hanover. End footnote. Provided it dresses itself up as anti-Zionism, young people are happy to align themselves with this reprehensible and idiotic anti-Semitism. We are not dealing here with a handful of youngsters led astray by their unreconstructed Nazi parents and grandparents, but with ostensible socialists. And nobody is opposing them in a sufficiently energetic manner. Far from it. The bourgeoisie, whether in Germany, in France, or in Belgium, is breathing a sigh of relief that for once it can march in step with a young generation it generally considers a nuisance, given its anti-authoritarian predilections. Aside from its own deeply rooted latent anti-Semitism, the bourgeoisie is pursuing its own vested interests, which coincide in a seamless and gratifying manner with the thoughtless anti-Semitism of the youngsters, most of whom have never met a Jew in person. It is interested in trade, mainly in oil. It is high time to, quote, come down on the right side, end quote, as these people would say. The multinational corporations who in all the Western democracies, in contravention of the law but fully in keeping with commercial principles, are more than happy to comply with the Arab boycott demands, know full well that les affaires sont les affaires. I don't know what that means, but there's a footnote. Let's see what the footnote says. Translation: business is business. End footnote. Assuming they have heard of the concept, they too are pleased to be moving with the objective spirit for once. Thus, anti-Semitism is becoming what, since the exposure of the Nazi atrocities, it no longer was or could be: a virtue. To be sure, anti-Semitism qua anti-Semitism might well have found it more difficult to regain its current level of respectability, were it not for the deep-seated, and if I may use the much-abused term, existential bond between the Jews, every single one of them, and the State of Israel. I must instantly qualify my contention that this concerns, quote, every single one of them, end quote. Wherever you look, you will, of course, find a handful of dutifully self-hating Jews who, in the service of some ideological fantasy or equally illusory and suicidal, quote, objectivity, end quote, are prepared to dispute this sense of solidarity even while it applies to them too. These special cases apart, and they tend to call for pity rather than condemnation. A bond ties the Jews, regardless of whether they are religious or not, whether they support or reject Zionism, whether they arrive in their host countries only recently or settled there long ago, to Israel's fortunes and misfortunes. I myself am a fairly typical case. I have never belonged to any Jewish religious community and was brought up a Catholic. I have no relatives in Israel, and my pending visit there will be my first. I come from a family that had long since established itself in Vorarlberg, Germany. In Vorarlberg. Germany was once my cultural home. France has since replaced it. I lived in Belgium for 38 years. And yet, if there is one state and commonwealth on earth whose existence and independence genuinely concerns me, it is Israel. Needless to say, this results from not bizarre mythical notions regarding blood ties and racial belonging. The crucial point is this: the existence of a Jewish state whose inhabitants are not just merchants but also farmers, not just intellectuals but also professional soldiers, who are not the, quote, usurers, end quote, of the new, not just intellectuals but also professional soldiers, who are not the, quote, usurers, end quote, the new Egypt is blathering about, all the empirical evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, but, for the most part, craftsmen and industrial or agricultural proletarians, has taught the Jews the world over to hold their heads high. The USSR and its vassal states have done everything within their power to cure the Jews of Marxism-Leninism. One need only think of the fate of Leopold Trepper, the erstwhile head of the intelligence organization Rote Kapelle, a convinced Marxist through and through, who eventually, when he was driven out of his Polish homeland, sought and found refuge in Israel. Which brings me to the issue of refuge, for there is indeed more at stake than the Jew's upright gait. Israel is not only the country in which the Jew no longer has his self-image impressed on him by his enemy in the manner described by Sartre. It is also the virtual refuge for all the humiliated and libeled Jews the world over. A case in point are the Jews in the Soviet Union and the countries of the Warsaw Pact, for whom, given their despair, an exit visa for Israel embodies their last remaining hope that they might yet lead their lives in dignity and an atmosphere of civility. I emphasize this hope is virtual. If their rights as Soviet citizens were no longer curtailed, only a small percentage of Soviet Jews would presumably want to settle in Israel. Just as only very few American Jews are keen to move to the Mediterranean country Thomas Mann described as, quote, dusty and stony, end quote. italics. Yet the existence of this virtual refuge is of crucial importance. End italics. The option of finding refuge in Israel, should some sinister fiend determine to expel the Jews emerge somewhere, an option the authorities during the British Mandate denied many of the Jews fleeing Hitler. This option connects each and every Jew to the fate of this tiny state in the Middle East. What, I wonder, would Monsieur Maxime Rodinson, Ernest Mandel, or Eric Rouleau, all of them ideologically alienated anti-Israeli Jews, do should they be threatened by a new Hitler? Footnote. The son of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, both of whom were murdered in Auschwitz, Maxime Rodinson, 1915 to 2004, was a Marxist intellectual and held a chair in Old Ethiopic and South Arabian languages at the Sorbonne. The Cairo-born journalist Eric Rouleau worked for the Middle East Service of Agence France Presse from 1953 to 1960 and from 1956 onward as a reporter and later columnist for Le Monde. His influence on the reporting of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in France was considerable. Under President Mitterrand, he served as France's ambassador to Tunisia and Turkey. Both Rodinson and Rouleau were staunch anti-Zionists. This is just a side point for me. I think Maxime Rodinson might have been anti-Zionist in principle, but not anti-Zionist in practice. I think he did acknowledge, he might have thought the foundation of Israel was a bad idea, but I'm pretty sure he thought it was, accepted it as a reality, and not that, he wasn't like an eliminationist anti-Zionist. I know the people who write for the Workers' Liberty Party, the fuck is his name? Something Randall and Camilla Bossi draw heavily on Maxime Rodinson's analysis of that conflict, and those people are both affirmative of that's kind of weird, but they're not I suppose they would say they were anti-Zionist insofar as they were anti-nationalist, but insofar as nationalism and nation states are a reality, they're committed to the right of Israel to exist as a country. But in principle, they're cosmopolitan internationalists. And so that's always a tricky thing, right? Is the balance of is having a consistent cosmopolitanism and a consistent internationalism entails not singling out particular states for non-existence, even though your overall critique is of the nation-state format, if that makes sense. But anyway, enough of my drawl. They would turn up in an Israeli consulate. Excuse me. I'll read the last sentence I read, just so we get back on track. What, I wonder, would Messrs. Maxime Rodinson, Ernest Mandel, and Eric Rouleau, all of them ideologically alienated anti-Israeli Jews, do should they be threatened by a new Hitler? They would turn up in an Israeli consulate, groveling pitifully for the documents that would allow them to rescue their skin and no longer give a damn about Marx's anti-Semitic misguided comments, which currently still form part of their canon. This is all I will say on what I have called the existential bond that ties all Jews to the state of Israel, a bond that has nothing whatsoever to do with some nationalist or religious form of mysticism, which would indeed be entirely illusory. My discussion is predicated on very real political, social, and psychological facts. I can already hear the objections. Quote, what about the Arabs? What about their state? What about their national dignity? End quote. I hear you ask, and these are legitimate concerns that need to be addressed. I am no Middle East expert and know no more about the history of Zionism than the next man who reads the papers. My limited knowledge is quite sufficient, however, to let me draw a number of conclusions that those who depend on their common sense and experts in the field alike will find equally plausible, provided their perspective has not been distorted by ideological concerns. The Palestinians, who did not exist as a national group when the first Zionist immigrants arrived in what is today Israel, are now undertaking the process of nation building, and they are entitled to their own state. The Arabs living within Israel's borders as they were prior to the Six-Day War are owed the right not to be treated as second-class citizens. As I have previously stated elsewhere in this conflict, legitimate claim is pitted against legitimate claim. Even so, one should not lose sight of the fact that it would, in principle, present no insurmountable difficulties to meet the claims of the Palestinians, those who live within Israel's original pre-1948 borders, and those who were displaced from their homes by the wars for which their Arab brethren are surely in no small measure responsible. What would it take? We need the former to be loyal Israeli citizens, and we need the latter finally and unreservedly to accept the existence of the Jewish nation state. All other issues are of a purely technical nature and could therefore be resolved with a reasonable measure of intelligence and goodwill. And what, finally, would we need from the public that, across the spectrum from the extreme right to the extreme left, so readily condemns Israel in the name of the right to national self-determination and national identity? It need merely acknowledge the self-evident fact that the much-maligned Zionist movement, too, is a national liberation movement, and that the Jews, who are the most tormented and tragic people on earth, are entitled to their national identity, too, assuming that they are searching for it. Alternatively, they may, in both religious and ethnic terms, have merged fully into their host societies. This, too, is a perfectly respectable solution, although it obviously takes two to play. The willingness to merge must be met by a willingness to absorb those intent on merging. The alarming banality of all this makes it no less true. Contrary to Adorno's warped contention that the banal can never be true, it is in fact always true. How else would the banal have become commonplace? I repeat, in the conflict in the Middle East, legitimate claim is pitted against legitimate claim. I would add, however, that the two parties are not endangered in equal measure, be it in the guise of the Saudi despot who is circulating the protocols of the elders of Zion, the religiously obsessed Gaddafi, the ostensibly, quote, moderate, end quote, Sadat, or the self-avowed Marxist Habash. The fact of the matter is that the Arab nation is hell-bent on eradicating the state of Israel, rather like one Herr Göring once hoped to do with the English cities. Footnote. In 1970, Anwar Sadat, 1918 to 1981, succeeded Nasser as Egypt's president. In 1978, he and Menachem Begin, he was the prime minister after Daniel Ben Gurion in Israel. Not sure though. Not an expert on Israel or the Middle East. Just reading like anybody else reads. received the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of their work toward the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty finally signed the following year. Sadat was assassinated by Islamists in October 1981. George Habash, 1926 to 2008, was the founder of the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. End footnote. It is an equally incontrovertible truth that there is no one on this planet who would raise the alarm if a new genocide were imminent. No one at all? This is obviously not entirely true. There are, for instance, public figures such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, widely recognized as lackeys of imperialism, who have taken issue with the shameless decisions of the UN and UNESCO. And there are a handful of others like them, but they have no power. Where power resides, from the White House in Washington to the Palais des Élysées, I don't know how to say that, from the Downing Street to the Kremlin, where one has long since forgotten that the majority of those who forged the old Russia into the fatherland of all proletarians were Jews, one is, not to put too fine a point on the diplomatic language, happy to defend the, quote, rights of the Arabs, end quote, which can be measured in petrodollars, while selling the rights of the Jews, which have, after all, been the eternal bane of the poor, for a few silver coins. Footnote. Simone de Beauvoir strongly opposed the decision of UNESCO's General Assembly in 1974 to exclude Israel from a regional working group because it had undertaken archaeological excavations. End footnote. This kind of realpolitik, in France, one uses the term la realpolitik to denote despicable opportunism, is inexorably seeping into the circulatory system of what we call public opinion, which, as we know from sociological research, consists only of opinions about opinions. The recent behavior of the Christian denominations and the Vatican in particular is a case in point for this shift in public opinion, which not so long ago was well disposed toward the Jews and Israel. The, quote, deputy, end quote, misses no opportunity to express his sympathies for the Palestinians, yet, to the best of my knowledge, he never protested when the corpses of Christians were mutilated in the context of the Lebanese Civil War, and remained silent when Palestinian commandos murdered Jewish youngsters. Footnote. This is a reference to Rolf Hochhuth's drama The Deputy from 1964, in which he took issue with the Vatican's failure to act in the face of the Shoah. End footnote. In February 1976, at an Islamic Christian gathering that took place in Gaddafi's Tripoli, of all places, representatives of the Vatican, despite some initial trepidation, subserviently signed up to a generalized condemnation of Israel, which could just as well have been formulated by Gaddafi himself. It denounced Zionism yet again as a form of racism, and included the following statement regarding Jerusalem. Quote, the Islamic character of Jerusalem has been firmly established. The Judaization, partition, and internationalization of the holy city must all be avoided, end quote. It was like a bad dream, as though the nightmare of a united Muslim and Christian crusade against Israel and the Jews had come true. To be sure, the Vatican subsequently renounced the document its representatives had inexplicably signed. It even went one step further. A gathering of Catholic and Jewish theologians in Jerusalem, Rome adopted a position that came close to being supportive of Israel. Even so, this hardly erases the parley, I don't know if that's how I'm saying it right, Parley, in Tripoli from collective memory. Nor does the Vatican's recantation detract from what one of the Muslim interlocutors in Tripoli told Western journalists in a private conversation. Quote, "The Vatican is isolated," end quote, he said, quote, "and desperately depends on the goodwill of the densely populated and extremely powerful Muslim world," end quote. It is indeed the fascination with power that has brought out the change of heart. Given that everyone knows how arduous it is to do so, no one wants to row against the flow. Hence those who are willing still to profess what seemed self-evident only yesterday but is considered outlandish today are few and far between. Only a moment ago it seemed natural to support the Israelis' right to their own state. Suddenly one is struck by the fact that this support has become a veritable test of courage. Indeed, tomorrow it might well be considered positively offensive. Whether it is the man who holds political responsibility, the cautious journalist, or the politically interested interlocutor on the street, they all look into the round in anticipation, as though to ask, with what and how much of it can I already get away with? To those for whom this process cannot go quickly enough, anyone who's familiar with the issue and has some intuition for the vacillations of the constantly vacillating will be inclined to offer the reassurance that there is already a great deal with which they can not only get away, but which is positively expected of them. Others, too clever by half, express their relief at the fact that a taboo has been broken, oblivious to the sinister forces whose bidding they are doing. The problem, and with this I return to my main line of argument, is that all this, the self-alienation of the left, the interests of international big business and the powers that be, the malice of the rulers and rapturous elation of the ruled and disinherited, it all resonates with a world in which, as it ever was, the Jew is burned. It resonates with the expression of what the Nazis would have called the, quote, sound will of the people, end quote, in Harlem, New York, with the gatherings of Philistines in the furths of the world, Furth, with I forget what this called, the two dots over the U, and, with the Café des Commerces in Dijon, with some random godforsaken dump in Kent, and all the more so with any given Arab bazaar. At this juncture, please allow me to digress. The supporters of the Arab cause frequently argue that in the world of Islam, in contrast to the Christian Occident, the Jews have always coexisted peacefully and amicably with the Muslims. Albert Memmi, a Tunisian Jew who lives in France and has persistently championed the cause of the North African Arabs under French rule, has demonstrated quite incontrovertibly in a richly documented book that this was by no means the case. Albert Memmi, it looks like it's called Jews and Arabs, but it's in French, so it's like Juif et Arabe. I don't know. Under Muslim rule, the Jews were always second-class citizens. Where they were able to work their way up the ranks, as was the case in Al-Andalus, their status nevertheless continued to be precarious. At best they were tolerated, but they were never genuinely accepted. This has not changed. It is possible for a communist who is also an Arab nationalist to be elected as mayor of an Israeli town. Yet in Syria or Iraq, or even in Tunisia, which is supposedly more moderate, all of them countries where the remaining Jews are no less indigenous than their Arab oppressors. The few Jews who still live there are subject to habitual humiliation, and their existence is under constant threat. The Christian world is no more interested in them than it is in the Soviet Jews. In both cases, the path of total assimilation is no more an option than is flight to the country that they still consider, even under extremely difficult economic circumstances. In both cases, the path of total assimilation is no more an option than is flight to the country that they still consider, under extremely difficult economic circumstances, the quote promised land, end quote. Being the existentialist, the positivist, and the adamantine atheist I am, I would not dream of treating the Jews' law as some sort of metaphysical issue. As far as I am concerned, the Jews are no more chosen than they are cursed. They are no more than the contingent product of 2 millennia worth of unfavorable historical constellations. The history of the human species is so vast it eludes comprehensive reconstruction. By these standards, 2 millennia constitute an extraordinarily brief time span. I can just see a man like Levi Strauss, who studied prehistoric societies and their structural myths, smiling placidly and with mild disdain at such, from his perspective, micro-temporal processes. Presumably, this particular member of the Académie Française would be disabused of this smile only if somebody were forcefully to bang on his door and issue the curt order that he, the Jew, must immediately open up and come along. Should he assume this could not happen to him, he would be quite mistaken. As is well known, Henri Bergson, too, a man of even greater stature, was forced to wear the yellow star until his death was kind enough to spare him the worst. No, the Jews in their historical existence are not metaphysical issues. As I say, they are the victims of contingency rather than necessity and of the same, quote, inertia of the heart, end quote, that has bestowed unspeakable misery on the medieval peasant and the proletarian in the developed capitalist order. I am consciously enlisting the antiquated term inertia of the heart because it does a better job of summarizing the relevant issues than do even the most ingenious socio-psychological studies on the matter. Those of you who are slightly older may recall witnessing how, during the Third Reich, laziness of the heart allowed people quickly to get used to the fact that their Jewish neighbors were being taken away in the dark of the night and deported. Today, there's a footnote I missed. Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908 to 2009, was a prominent social anthropologist and leading structuralist. In 1941, he was able to flee France on the same boat as André Breton, the great surrealist and eventually anarchist poet, Anna Segers, who I don't know, and Victor Serge, who, if you're watching this channel or listening to this channel, you probably know who Victor Serge is. To Martinique and from there to New York, where he taught at the New School before returning to France after the war. Anyway, end of footnote. Today, anyone can observe how the inner hearts are accommodating themselves to the fact that the capitalist and socialist worlds alike are isolating the Israelis and the Jews affiliated with them, no matter where they are, and in so doing, abandoning them to the catastrophe looming over them like a thundercloud. The Middle Eastern question has suddenly become a Jewish question, and we know from history that what the answer to this question looks like. The cautious but unambiguous manner in which everyone is backing away from both from Israel and, with it, from all Jews will hardly surprise someone who has encountered inner hearts before. The millions of Jews presented as burnt offerings, and what if there really were only, quote, what if there really were, quote, only, end quote, 5 or even 4 and not 6 million of them, have been paid off? Surely these perpetual gadflies should now keep their peace. We have other problems: recession, inflation, unemployment, energy problems. One left the wretch to fall. Woe will befall him, and the world, in the manner of Pontius Pilate, will wash its hands of him. Footnote. This is a reference to the second verse of the Harpist Song in Book 2, Chapter 13 of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, published in 1795. In the translation of William Edmondson Aytoun and Theodore Martin, the relevant passage reads, quote, "Ye leave the wretch to fall, then yield him up in woe," end quote. End of footnote. Anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Zionism has come to be seen as virtuous. This is not the place to discuss its roots. Everyone is familiar with them. They have received ample attention. I want just to emphasize what I have observed in many radio and television programs and newspaper articles. With an inner heart, one pretends not to know of the existential connection between diaspora Jewry and Israel. One obtusely refuses to recognize that this union of desperation is not some fantastical folly, but simply reflects the fact that the once bitten Jew knows in his heart of hearts where to find the closest and only emergency room willing to treat him. The virtuous anti-Semite has an enviably clear conscience and a perfectly calm disposition. His peace of mind is enhanced further by the fact that he knows he is in step with the historical development. Should he occasionally awaken from his stupor, he ritualistically raises the usual questions. Is Israel not an expansionist state, an imperialist outpost? Has it not caused the adversity it faces from all sides itself, given the, quote, inflexibility, end quote, of its policies? Did not the original sin of colonialism inhere in the Zionist idea from the outset, rendering every Jew who sympathizes with this country guilty? There is little point in trying to discuss these issues. Israel's expansion resulted from belligerent Arab fanaticism, which from 1948 onward had nothing more to offer the Jews than the promise to, quote, push them into the sea, end quote. The Jewish colonialism was one not of conquest, but derived etymologically and politically from the Latin term colonus, or colonus, Colonus, farmer. Israel's, quote, inflexibility, end quote, is that of someone who stands with his back to the wall. He is inflexible not for lack of trying, but because he has been systematically robbed of the option of being flexible. One second, sorry. Not that I am unaware of Israel's policy mistakes, but I am much more profoundly and acutely aware of the fact that these mistakes pale into ludicrous insignificance when compared to the real political RELPOLITIKAL indifference of others, of the Russians and the British, the French and Germans, and likely of tomorrow's Americans too. Not to mention the Arabs whose evident compulsion to celebrate their nation-building process by sacrificing the Jews as a burnt offering beggars belief. The altars reek with human gore. Footnote. This is a line from Goethe's poem Bride of Corinth, first published in Schiller's Musenalmanach in 1798, in which Goethe pitted pagan sensualism against Christian chastity. As the female protagonist explains in the Aytoun and Martin translation, following the conversion of her family to Christianity, quote, on the cross a Savior they adore, victims slay they here. Neither lamb nor steer, but the altars reek with human gore, end quote. The German edition of Arthur Koestler's Spanish Testament, published in 1937, bore this line as its title, Menschenopfer unerhört. End footnote. All this is well established, especially where the Jews are concerned. Sacrificing the Jew has considerable pedigree. It is a hallowed tradition. Habits are not easily broken. What, then, might the week of brotherliness which has brought us together achieve? I have to admit to not being particularly optimistic in this regard. However, I am not just a pessimist by nature, but also a believer in the Enlightenment by temperament. And my home has always been pretty far to the left on the political map. Hence I will not let myself be deterred from addressing a few words to my friends on the left. I stand little chance of getting through to those on the right anyway. Even when they present themselves as genuinely pro-Israel, I remain skeptical. I want to stress that I do not doubt that there are some sincere conservatives, maybe even former Nazis, who are earnest about their friendship with the Jews and the state of Israel, and whose motivation does not spring exclusively from the desire to exculpate themselves, but from the fact that they really have changed their minds on the matter. But as the representative of the social class it serves, the tradition it upholds, and the political legacy it passes on, the right is in no position to develop the sort of unprejudiced attitude toward the Jew one should be able to expect today. It would be absurd to give the circles that funded Hitler only a few decades ago the benefit of the doubt. For them, the fate of the Jews is merely a convenient argument against anything and everything that sets out to challenge our society in its current form. Let us not forget that the calm to which the right aspires is the silence of the grave, and its preferred means of maintaining order, oppression. The Jews, however, including the Israeli Jews, and in fact Israeli Jews in particular, are an element of fertile disorder. Wherever ossified structures have been broken down, there they were. From the Young Germany movement to the work of the Frankfurt School in Germany, as proponents of the Popular Front, then as Sartreans, and as structuralists in France, at the heart of the liberal movement in the United States. Footnote. Junges Deutschland is an umbrella term for a loose grouping of liberal-minded, politically committed literary figures active in the territories of the German Confederation in the period between the late 1820s and the revolutionary uprisings beginning in March 1848, the so-called Vormärz, i.e. pre-March, or Vormärz. That's probably how it's actually pronounced. In 1835, the authorities banned the writings of most of the authors they identified with the movement. I think Friedrich Engels, I'm not sure about Marx, but definitely Friedrich Engels, I think, got his introduction to liberal politics prior to his commitment to communism from being involved in the Young Germany movement, but I'm not sure. So take that with a grain of salt, but I would give myself a solid 90% positive. As far as the Middle East is concerned, there can be no doubt that it was the Jewish settlers in Palestine and their attempt to create a democratic and socialist society that roused the Arab nation from its deep centuries-long feudal sleep. Given that it may be misguided but is essentially munificent, the left might want to take this into consideration. It does not bear contemplating that it should be the descendants of the likes of Heine and Berne, of Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, of Erich Mühsam and Gustav Landauer, who bear the responsibility for the proliferation of this supposedly virtuous anti-Semitism, which is the inevitable outgrowth of the rabid anti-Zionism that poses a lethal threat for every Jew, no matter where he lives and regardless of his political orientation. This is not hyperbole. Only a shred of imagination is required to envisage what would occur if Israel were destroyed. Sorry, there's several footnotes here that I need to read. Born to wealthy Jewish parents in Dusseldorf, Heinrich Heine, 1797 to 1856, who converted to Protestantism for pragmatic reasons in 1825 and moved to Paris in 1831, was one of the greatest German language poets of the 19th century. Heine soon outgrew his Romanticist peers to parody and satirize their excessive sentimentality and engage in a razor-sharp critique of the political and social conditions and developments in the German-speaking lands. End footnote. Footnote. Like Heine, Ludwig Berne, 1786 to 1837, who came from a Jewish family in Frankfurt, Maine, converted to Protestantism for pragmatic reasons and turned his back on Germany to move to Paris in 1830. He was a prominent journalist and critic and closely associated with the Young Germany movement. Heine and Berne were embroiled in a long-standing, truly vicious, fratricidal fracas. Footnote. Next footnote. Born to Jewish parents in Berlin, Erich Mühsam, 1878 to 1934, was a poet, writer, and anarchist activist imprisoned in 1919 for his role in Munich's short-lived Soviet Republic. Arrested after the Reichstag fire at the end of February 1933, Mühsam was interned, abused, and tortured in a succession of prisons and camps before being murdered in the Oranienburg concentration camp in July 1934. Next footnote. Born to Jewish parents in Karlsruhe, Gustav Landauer, 1870 to 1919, was a well-known anarchist and pacifist closely associated with Martin Buber and Erich Muzam. Following the military defeat of the Munich Soviet Republic, he was arrested by Freikorps troops and murdered on his arrival at Stadelheim prison. Was Stadelheim prison where the Red Army faction was held? I don't know. Maybe I'm making that up. I wouldn't guess so, because the prison that they were in looked very modern to me, but I don't know. But there you are. There's a bunch of people of Jewish background who contributed very much so to the development of a democratic international left. Where was I? Fleeing the sword of the Prophet Muhammad, the Jewish survivors, retransformed into the mythical wandering Jews, would spread out across the globe, and would again react as it did after 1933, when underpopulated states like Canada and Australia closed their doors to the Jews as though they were carriers of the plague. The Jews would again be compelled to take on questionable illegal jobs and engage in obscure financial transactions to make a living. Not even as guest workers would one accept them, especially in times of crisis. The public would be consumed by a time-honored version of the Jewish question, which, if we believe Sartre, has never been a Jewish question and was in fact always the anti-Semites question. No UN refugee committee would be able to gain ordinary citizenship rights for them anywhere. Anti-Zionism would be dead, to be sure, but crude anti-Semitism, retrieved from the deepest depths of the collective unconscious, and brought up to date, would yet again be retransformed from a contingent historical constellation into a myth, the myth of Ahasuerus and Shylock. I don't know who Ahasuerus was, but Shylock is from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. And he's like I don't know, the stereotype of like a greedy Jewish merchant or something like that. I think he wants like a pound of flesh or something, like he says that the debt he's owed is a pound of flesh. I think that, I don't know if that's where the idea of like you owe someone a pound of flesh comes from, but I think that was a pretty big part of Merchant of Venice. I don't know much about Shakespeare or Merchant of Venice. I've only really have experience with Richard III and a little bit with Macbeth. But anyway, enough about me and all the things that my genius, my unstoppable, fat, thick genius knows. Anyway, back to the text. This would have two principal consequences, and it is high time that we confront them even now. It would wreak total destruction on a group of human beings and amount to the self-destruction of what was up until then the left. The latter is already underway. Even now, we are witnessing self-avowed, quote, leftist, end quote, political groups remain silent when a reprehensible Ugandan despot and paranoid commits heinous murder. How they fail to protest when the absolute ruler of Libya issues laws stipulating that adulterous women should be stoned. How they have nothing to say about the fact that not one of the grand chefs historiques of the Algerian Revolution is anywhere to be seen. Ben Bella? He has merely moved from the prisons of the fascist French officers to those of the, quote, socialist, end quote, Boumediene. The left keeps stumm. I don't know what stumm means, but I'm going to assume from my context clues that that means quiet. The Ugandan leader they're talking about is Idi Amin, who, if you don't know, definitely was very, very anti-Semitic. Definitely praised Hitler for his like accomplishments, his so-called accomplishments. It was just a brutal fuck in general. The person installing the stoning in Libya was Gaddafi, And what else does the footnote say? Following the military coup he led against Algeria's first president, Ahmed Ben Bella, who was alive from 1916 to 2012. Damn. Bitch lived a long time. Houari Boumediene, 1932 to 1978, was the chairman of the Revolutionary Council of Algeria from 1965 to 1976, and the country's second president from 1976 until his death. Okay, into those footnotes. He has merely moved from the prisons of the left keeps stum. And when it does have something to say, its vocabulary is quite literally deranged. D-ranged. It stubbornly insists that the vicious regimes in Libya and Iraq, where communists too are occasionally thrown in jail, are, quote, progressive, end quote. Yet in the leftist mythology, Israel, which is not an ideal state to be sure, but still a commonwealth in which oppositional activities, even anti-national forms of opposition, are permitted, is a, quote, reactionary, end quote, country. The problem goes far beyond those eerie dialectics which everyone and everything can be justified. It is the it's the political witches 101. It amounts to total conceptual confusion and the ultimate loss of moral and political standards. I am generally convinced that the left needs to reinvent itself by revitalizing the problem of Israel, i.e. the Jewish problem. Does it still stand for humanistic values, yes or no? Is its concept of democracy still concerned with universal suffrage and the freedom of speech and assembly, with the droit de l'homme, which is French for human rights, it says in the footnotes, which have, after all, been with us since the French Revolution? Does the left consider nationalism, as it always did, a political error born of pig-headedness? Or does it now consider it agreeable wherever it is directed by tyrants against Jews, but unjust as soon as Jews, in the face of unbearable pressure, fall into its trap? Not least, is the left prepared to acknowledge that so-called formal democracy, even though it cannot fully come into its own even though it cannot fully come into its own unless it is complemented by economic democracy, must nevertheless be its priority, since without it economic democracy cannot be established? Is, to raise the final question, justice still a binding concept for the left? It has been its raison d'etre since its inception. If the left sacrifices it in order to subscribe to the fetish of revolution, it obliterates itself. Which brings us right back to the issue of Israel and the Jews. As Gromyko expressly acknowledged at the time on behalf of the Soviet Union, the establishment of Israel was an act of justice. No one can deny, of course, this act of restitution entailed injustices for the Arabs, nor is it my intention to conceal this. Even so, the injustice inflicted on the Arabs can be remedied without causing a conflict of global significance. Even now, they are not strictly speaking homeless and own two states, Jordan, where they form the majority of the population, and Lebanon, which, jointly with Syria, they control. To be sure that Israel and the world's Jews should help the Arabs regain their full rights is a legitimate demand. However, the destruction of the Jewish state, and this is what Arab politics in their entirety, from the right to the far left, from the Saudi king to George Habash, aspire to, avowedly or not, would amount to an irrevocable injustice. Assuming we are prepared to approach the issue in a matter-of-fact way, it takes no more than a cursory glance at history to recognize this. It is precisely at this point that the left, should it want to find itself again, would need to begin the major task of freeing itself from a number of myths and vocabulary whose clutches it finds itself. If it withdrew its unconditional support from the Arabs and gave up on its mechanical yea-saying, it could actually make a contribution to the solution of the Israeli question and the Jewish problem alike. That the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews, given the unbearable strain they are under, want a reconciliation is not in doubt, nor that the Jews outside Israel understand their position. The strong and wealthy Arab nation has little to fear. In a peaceful Middle East, the dreams of a greater Israel would disappear of their own accord, as would the permanent fear that plagues diaspora Jewry along with the aggressive response it engenders. The Jews should be free to choose between both options to assimilate, in keeping with the spirit of the Enlightenment in their host countries, or to move to Israel, which still has space enough, even within the borders of 1967, to accommodate what would likely be a limited number of immigrants anyway. This is what the left should be demanding. The crucial point to my mind is that the left, which may help shape the future spirit and fates of the Western world, should abandon its systematic anti-Zionism. For Jews and, therefore, in a historically objective sense, anti-Zionism inevitably bears the repugnant traits of traditional anti-Semitism. It is almost embarrassing how little insight is required to comprehend this. The young socialists, communists, Maoists, and Trotskyites need only imagine what it would be like if the powers that be told them, quote, "Our issue is not with you, but only with world Bolshevism. We do not object to your leftist orientation. However, you may not teach, may not enter the civil service, may not hold public assemblies, and should you form parties, you would be breaking the law," end quote. It should be easy enough for them to imagine the situation and recognize that their anti-Zionist affect mobilizes an aggressively Zionist response, on the one hand, and the sort of anti-Semitic emotions on the other that have been part and parcel of the history of the Occident and the Orient for 2 millennia, and are as much a latent option today as they ever were. Who, if not the left, should be showing any attempt to present this anti-Semitism perfunctorily masquerading as anti-Zionism as a virtue of the ice-cold shoulder? In contrast to the traditional right with its focus on maintaining the status quo, the left is not entitled to the aforementioned inertia of the heart. It is not entitled to self-mystification, to warped revolutionary mythology, to abstruse German idealism Thomas Mann once characterized with the words, quote, "If it did not sound like a detestable condemnation, it might be said that they, bracket the Nazis, end bracket, committed their crimes for dreamy idealism," end quote. The left, there's a footnote here. That's from Thomas Mann, Germany and the Germans. And, okay, that's it. The left, if it understands its role correctly, is a child of the Enlightenment, of the encyclopedists, of the Great French Revolution, of the intellectual and poetic impact of Lessing, Heine, Berne, Moses Mendelssohn, and Feuerbach. Today, more than ever, it should emphatically subscribe to the sentiments Sartre expressed in an interview during the Yom Kippur War. All I know is that in this conflict, 3 million people are pitted against 100 million. They should also heed another utterance by Sartre, whose heart, fortunately, still beats on the left, albeit in a ruined body. Quote, "Not one Frenchman will be secure so long as a single Jew in France or in the world at large can fear for his life." End quote. Sartre wrote these lines in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, at a time when the burnt smell of Auschwitz was still in the air, and no one in his right mind would have dared to violate the Jews' rights, whether in Palestine, in France, or elsewhere in the world. At the time, no Jew needed to fear for his life simply because he was a Jew. The burnt smell has dissipated over time. In Israel, every Jew, no matter how brave, must fear for his life. And so must every Jew the world over. Maybe only those who have witnessed the homicidal rage of the Third Reich can genuinely appreciate or understand this. Ladies and gentlemen, the man who stands before you did witness this homicidal rage. He was patted down not, as in the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, to see whether he had been fattened sufficiently, but to ascertain whether he was scrawny enough to be slaughtered. I am appealing to the world's, empathy, above all, however, to your intelligence when I call out anti-Semitism, even when it calls itself anti-Zionism, is not virtuous. Far from it. It is an ineradicable, quote, stain on the honor, end quote, of civilized humanity. Please do not take my remarks personally. I know that, regardless of your political orientation, those of you who have come here for the opening of the, quote, week of brotherliness, end quote, have done so in genuine good faith. Why else would you have come? However, given that my words may well reach beyond those of us assembled here and our agreement, in principle, I have opted for the formulations you have heard. The problem of the age-old anti-Semitism, which presents itself as virtuous and fashionable, goes far beyond anything Christian-Jewish relations could possibly remedy. It concerns the world at large and its history. Wherever and whenever those of us who are in agreement have the slightest opportunity to intervene with our words in the historical trial, which is once again being conducted against the Jews, we're duty-bound to make our voices heard, morally, politically, polemically, and with the emotional force that befits a good cause. Now that I have been to Israel, I have since visited Israel for the first time, and I take nothing back. I saw a country in arms, a country as vibrant as it is poor. The class distinctions are disconcerting. In Tel Aviv, of all places, I set foot in a Hollywood mansion for the first time. I saw Arabs in the occupied territories and Bedouins, I should know how to pronounce that word, who are as proud as the legends lead one to expect. The poor but own transistor radios that give them access to the voices of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I spoke to hot-headed anti-Zionist Jews who question the very principles on which the State of Israel rests. This does not, however, prevent them from taking up positions as Israel University teachers. I spoke to a leftist kibbutznik who has been there for 40 years and has long since been transformed from an intellectual into a farmer, a Jewish Israeli farmer who speaks the most pristine German I have heard in a very long time. He told me a melancholy joke about God who asked the archangel Gabriel about his people in Israel. Quote, "They are in good spirits," end quote. The sword-bearing angel replied, quote, "Oy vey, end quote, the Lord responded, resting his troubled head in his hand. Quote, I fear they are relying on me yet again, end quote. The farmer then added in a serious tone, quote, maybe it will all end in tears, but the world will have to pay a much higher price for our hides than it realizes, end quote. But the world will have, What he meant became clear to me when I subsequently read in the press about Israel's nuclear weapons. A people of conquerors? To be sure, there is a minority who want to expand the realm and create a greater Israel. The overwhelming majority certainly does not. Agitated interlocuteurs spoke to me of the government's, quote, inflexibility, end quote, and stressed the need for a far-reaching unilateral gesture. Quote, what is the point of reaching out, end quote, others wonder. Quote, if our neighbors are intent on spitting into our hand, at best, and want to chop it off at worst, end quote. My attention was drawn to the Lebanese example, where Arabs are fighting against Arabs with a brutality we thought was no longer possible. By coincidence, I bumped into a, quote, Aryan, end quote, German woman who had converted to Judaism and was absolutely convinced that one could not possibly relinquish Rachel's tomb. Footnote. This refers to the burial place of the biblical matriarch Rachel, who is located just outside Bethlehem. From 1948 to 1967, it was under Jordanian control and administered by the Islamic Waqf. I don't know how to pronounce that. End footnote. And equally by coincidence, I met some gorgeous Arab boys who say shalom when they beg in Bethlehem, but in whom one can already discern the determination of the future Palestinian nationalist, for whom shalom, peace with the Jews, is inconceivable. I also saw the occupation. It was not a pretty picture. Armed occupiers inevitably take on the air of a master race. Yet whenever I gave these young Israeli warriors a ride in my car, I saw only utterly exhausted wretches buckling under the weight of their machine guns. Incidentally, and this may be pure coincidence, or the coincidence may reflect a statistical truth, nearly all of them were, quote, black, end quote, Jews. Their parents had come from Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. One of them, whose features were entirely negroid, even came from Libya. By way of an explanation, he simply said, quote, Gaddafi, end quote. And I saw the fanatics in kaftans at the Wailing Wall whom I found extremely ominous, given what I know of their subterranean influence, which weighs heavily enough to prevent the government from agreeing to an internationalization of all these sites of hopeless superstition. Mr. Kissinger, the tragic Jew from Furt, lurks somewhere in the background, tasked with the implementation of American power politics in the region. The contradictions of the situation are literally maddening. And yet many think it is entirely straightforward. I spoke to a young soldier of North African descent who told me that he was paid 150 Israeli pounds, roughly 60 Deutschmarks, a month, and his family was poor. When I commiserated, he interrupted me and said, quote, I don't like to fight, but I want to live, so I shall fight, end quote. Everything seems to be headed for this fight, for a final reckoning. I can see no solution. The Arabs demand their rights and the Jews theirs. Their claims rule each other out. Bertrand Russell once said, quote, it was a mistake to settle the Jews in Palestine, but now that the state exists, it would be an even greater mistake to want to get rid of it, end quote. One has to be a fool not to see that the Arabs, from the Saudi despot to Arafat and his realpolitik, from Gaddafi to the communist nationalist, or should I say national socialist mayor of Nazareth, clearly want to destroy Israel. It is equally clear that the world powers would breathe a sigh of relief if Israel really were made to go away. that the whole constellation could render acute again in a tragic way the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, which has been kept under the lid since Auschwitz, is the ultimate consequence we need to confront even now. No, I take nothing back. Far from it. Seeing for myself has convinced me of the legitimacy of my position. It has merely robbed me of my last remaining illusions that I might stand in the slightest chance of convincing the public of my stance. The end.